COVID lockdowns may seem like a distant memory, and everyday life, well, it's very much getting back to those pre-pandemic norms. But for children, it seems we're only just getting a sense of the emotional and behavioural impacts those couple of years have had. And the results of two separate studies published revealed some big findings in terms of children's social and emotional skills and eating disorders among the under-18s. I'm Leah Boleto, and this is what we're exploring on the Sky News Daily. Now, the former Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, she'll join us in a bit to talk about the potential long-term consequences.
We really need to take a very practical response here.
And we'll also hear from a charity that provides emotional support for families. But first, let's take a look at that research suggesting children's social, behavioural and emotional skills worsened during the first year of the pandemic. This was a joint study between University College London and the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Sarah Cattan is the Associate Director of the IFS and one of the authors in the study. Talk to me a bit about what you found.
A year into the pandemic, we surveyed over 6,000 households with school-age children. About half of parents reported their children's socio-emotional development worsened during the first year of the pandemic. So lots of things could be at play here. We know that children's lives were completely disrupted in many ways during that period. But what we ask in this piece is really whether all the disruptions that we know happened to parents' working lives during this period had anything to do with the changes in children's socio-emotional development that we saw.
So what does that mean then? So that parents, whether they had a job or they lost job or they had to take on more hours perhaps, that was all having a big impact on how children were feeling and how children were developing?
What really comes out of our study is the fact that children whose parents experienced more instability in their job circumstances, so those who became unemployed or those who went on furlough, their children were more likely to see their socio-emotional development worsen during this time. So this is relative to children whose parents experienced more stability during this period.
Talk to me about the numbers then, Sarah. Who were finding it tough? You know, are we talking the under 6 or the teenagers?
Those younger children, as well as the girls, were more likely to experience a worsening in their socio-emotional development. Now, when we look at the impact of those disruptions to parents' working lives, we find that the effect is actually more strongly felt among children who are in relatively more well-off families. And we think this is quite consistent with other evidence that has shown that the psychological effects of unemployment are worse the first few times that it's experienced. And so for those relatively more well-off families, it could have been the first time that they experienced this instability.
What are you going to do with this bit of research then? How are you going to use it for the better? And will you be doing any follow-up studies?
I hope we will. This has been an ongoing issue. The pandemic exacerbated these problems, and there is a real urgency to put children's well-being really high on the policy agenda. There's been a lot of focus of the effect of the pandemic on the learning losses, on academic outcomes, but we know that these socio-emotional outcomes are actually really also important in promoting academic success. And so if the government really wants to have a comprehensive strategy at helping children catch up with the learning losses they would have experienced during the pandemic, they really do need to focus on psychological well-being as well.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you very much.
The Children's Commissioner in England looked at NHS data for people getting treatment for eating disorders, and it showed that the number of under-18s receiving such care had doubled in 6 years to nearly 1,200. Anne Longfield is the former Children's Commissioner for England. We will talk about eating disorders in a moment, but first of all, I wanted to get your reaction to the findings of the IFS and the UCL study looking at children's behaviour and emotional development. What did you think?
It's one of many pieces of evidence that are now coming forward, which shows the damage that children experienced during the pandemic. Children, of course, weren't at the greatest risk of the virus itself, but the secondary risks to them in terms of their mental health and their wider well-being is something which is now becoming clearer and clearer.
I was speaking to my son's head teacher at the school gates the other day, and he said year 6, so what's that, they're 10 or 11 years old.
The final year of primary school.
Yeah, that final year, he was saying he had noticed out of all the year 6s they have had through that school, that particular post-pandemic year 6 but had behavioural problems, weren't able to self-regulate, and he found that very different from the others that had gone through that year. How do we gauge, how do we get a sense of how big a problem this is for not only parents, schools and the government?
When life gets back to something like normal, it doesn't just evaporate, it's there, it's in those children's memories. I've got a nephew in that year, and all teachers will always say, that's the COVID year children. They're the ones who are struggling. They have delays in terms of what you'd normally expect for that age range in terms of social and emotional development, but also they struggle with some of the structures of school, the rules, all of those kind of things. What I've been advocating from the start is that there is a proper recovery program for children that not only helps them catch up in their schooling, but also helps them deal with that, those emotional challenges that they have experienced through school. And some of that can be simply, having more time to play together, more time to have in out of school activities, sports, arts and the like.
Do you think the government are dealing with it well? Do you think they have a handle on it?
I've really not seen evidence that government in any way grasps the seriousness of this situation or the fact that these are long-term problems. It hasn't invested in a long-term recovery program to the extent it could. There's been good work around tutoring, but that's quite a narrow aspect of what children needed to be able to get over that experience. I think that, we can see it in the classroom now in terms of behaviour. We can see it in the huge numbers of children who simply aren't attending school. Over a fifth of children are now persistently absent from school. These are kind of, systemic issues that are going to affect us all, not only those children in the classroom, but looking to the labour force and the workplace of tomorrow.
When we think back to COVID and that lockdown, there were two experiences, weren't there? There were those who were baking banana bread with their children in the garden, and there were those who didn't have that lifestyle. But let's talk and explore who is really impacted by these studies.
Some children reported that during the first lockdown, they actually enjoyed life more because they got access to the parents. The weather was sunny. There were lots of opportunities at home that they were enjoying. But for those kids that lived in very cramped conditions, often that time with siblings and parents at home, some of them even homeless and sofa surfing, some of them not having the tech to be able to get online, possibly sharing phones, even broken phones with siblings. So there was a huge divide. It is something which is still a long shadow over many children's lives who were struggling before the pandemic and now have much heightened vulnerabilities in their life, not least those many children who now haven't returned to school on a regular basis, which are causing great concerns, not only in terms of their life chances and education, but also in terms of the adults who are always on the lookout for vulnerable children to prey on them and exploit them.
It's not just social behaviours, because we've got NHS data suggesting that actually the number of children receiving treatment for eating disorders, well, that's doubled in 6 years.
As with all of these emotional issues, so much of it is hidden. Eating disorders did skyrocket during the pandemic. Again, mental health skyrocketed, or poor mental health skyrocketed during that time. So we're now in a situation where 1 in 6 children are assessed to have a probable mental health condition. Sadly, anxiety, depression, sometimes the kind of anxieties that lead to eating disorders, is now part and parcel of so many children's childhoods. If we've got a nation of children who are anxious, who are depressed, who are concerned about not only their own potential, but have severe self-esteem issues, then really we not only owe it to those children, but we really need to take a very practical response here and meet those needs. Ensure that they have the kind of mentoring support, the mental health support to be able to really help them get over these challenges. We know that when there is that kind of support in place, children can recover and fly, but without it, it's not going to go away. It's going to store up problems for the future.
Do you think the country was prepared or took the right approach when it came to children?
Oh, I think children were too often at the end of the line when it came to decisions during the pandemic. Of course, they weren't at the greatest health risk, but there was a whole cocktail of secondary risks that needed considering. Decision makers on occasion seem to understand that, but too often couldn't hold that consistent determination to put children first. And I think what we're seeing is we've got a generation of children now who have the damage and the experience of unnecessary periods of lockdown, unnecessary periods of absence out of education, and unnecessary strains on their own mental health that could have been curtailed and could have been minimized if we'd have taken a much more positive approach to putting children first in terms of decisions during that COVID period.
What do you think then will be the long-term consequences?
We know that children aren't returning to school. In the hard world of economics and productivity in our labour force, that's a gap that we as a country can't afford to be complacent about. We need all of our potential workforce to be able to achieve as great a prospect and potential as they can. And my worry is that we're just not recognising that there's a generation of children here who are not going to be able to progress and succeed in their work or in their wider lives to the extent that we know that they could and should, but as the extent that we also know that we as a country need them to. So there is no benefit for anyone for ignoring what's happened in children's lives. It's coming down the track, it's storing up problems. And we as a country, both in terms of the economics of our labour force, but also the cost to the public purse for supporting these children as adults, is something which is going to cost us dearly.
Anne, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure, thank you.
We're joined now by Rhys Barfoot, who works for Family Action. Hello, Rhys. I don't know much about Family Action. Can you just bring me up to speed on the charity and what it does?
Family Action is a charity that's been operating for about 170 years with our aim to transform lives by providing financial, emotional and financial support to those experiencing poverty, disadvantage or social isolation across the country. Within my role, I currently work for the Head Start team, where we provide opportunities for young people to build confidence, resilience and to support them into employment or training.
So, Rhys, you would have seen these studies then. What have families been saying to you about that time? You must have helped quite a few.
Lots of our families that we're currently working with express that lots of the children and young people are really struggling with transitioning back into society post-COVID. Many of them are expressing that there's great negative impact on their mental health and well-being. We had a young person very recently during COVID. She spent her entire time indoors, didn't socialise with anybody, really struggled to socialise with her family as well. And then kind of as the lockdowns continued and then kind of eased, she really struggled to kind of integrate back into society to the point where when she recently started college, she was having to get her mum, who was on a mobility scooter, to basically take her back and forth on like multiple buses across London just for her to even get the confidence to even attend college.
Rhys, talk to me about some of the signs parents perhaps could look out for their children who are struggling.
Each young person's different. They have different personalities, different behavioural traits. But I think for any kind of concerned parents or guardians, what I would look at as the initial signs are like continued changes in behaviour. So if you have a young person that is quite extroverted, quite lively, quite bubbly, and then And then say after like a couple of weeks, you start noticing that they're starting to get withdrawn, like isolated from themselves, isolated from their family. That's when the right conversations need to be had with that young person. If you are struggling to kind of reach out, or there is a barrier for you to have conversations with your child or young person, like access digital sources. If you can't get the young people to come to you, then go to the young people.
There must have been many, many families that got in touch with you to say, look, we're good parents, but we're really struggling here because of that lockdown and the impacts it's had on behaviour, on kids trying to, just self-regulate, all of those normal things that are tricky anyway.
Yeah. So I used to work in further education throughout the lockdowns. My work's phone was buzzing, continually throughout the night, basically, of young people like seeking desperate help because of their mental health and well-being.
I wanted to talk to you about the other study because it's NHS figures this time. They're suggesting a doubling in 6 years of the number of under 18s receiving treatment for eating disorders. Is that something that you've seen?
There's two ways to look at this question. Personally, we're seeing that actually there is a lot of like food poverty when it comes to children and young people. There's many programs that I've run myself and also colleagues where young people are turning up just to eat. Like it's their only meal of the day. They're taking home food for their siblings for the evening. On the flip side as well, we are experiencing that a lot of kind of like the older young people are getting massive like body confidence image issues or body dysmorphia, really lower self-esteem about their appearance. It's a really tough question because there's so many like potential answers. But yeah, we are noticing a massive rise in this happening.
Do you feel hopeful that you can tackle this, you can support young people? And like you say, they are going to be the future leaders, the future doctors, the teachers. Are we in an okay state, do you think, for the future?
I really, really hope that there is a real drive to recognise that there's been massive implications from multiple lockdowns, and really, really hope that policymakers, business leaders, whoever, just like take up the initiative to really support young people into transitioning into like late adolescence and adulthood. But I am hopeful.
Rhys, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we've had a response from the government. Let me read you their statement. They say, we know children were amongst those most affected by the pandemic, and we're committed to helping them catch up academically as well as socially and in terms of emotional well-being. All pupils are taught about mental health well-being as part of relationships, sex and health education, and we're investing an additional £2.3 billion a year in NHS mental health services by March 2024. If you're looking for another podcast to listen to this weekend, why not try our new Sky News series called Dirty Work, about Interpol red notices and some of the people who end up on the wrong end of one. You'll find it where you get this one.